Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My appreciation to these two witnesses for their endurance, for staff, and for yourself and ranking member. I have just a few brief questions. Thank you. There was an article in Reuters last week that Russia was supporting Assad through civilian aircraft. The House passed the Caesar bill, and which would impose sanctions for this type of action. So my question is, realizing the bill has not made it through the Senate, are sanctions being considered for this? And could you speak to the importance of getting this bill through the Senate and how helpful that would be to the administration?
With respect to any assistance being provided to Iran or the Assad regime, we are quite keen to use all existing authorities to address any states, any entities that may be involved, and that certainly includes Russia. With respect to the Caesar bill, we would have to get back with a considered position on this, particularly with respect to the question you just posed.
Thank you. Let me ask you for a moment to consider a different audience. Consider my constituents back home who will hopefully be watching this and are struggling to understand war powers. And perhaps if you could just take a minute and explain the difference between Article 2 and the AUMF and what was applied here in a way that they might be able to digest that.
I'll try to take that on. Volumes have been written on this topic over the course of the last 200 years. The Article 2 authority granted to the President by the Constitution as Commander-in-Chief is quite broad. There are requirements which follow upon use of that authority. That is, the White House must report use of forces to the Congress within a specified time limit. But the authority itself is constitutional, and it is quite sweeping. An AUMF, and in the case of Syria, Iraq, we typically deal with two extant AUMFs, one from 2001, one from 2002, are focused on substance. They deal with certain specified entities or types, categories of threat. They are sometimes limited in time. These two were not, but they could be. So an AUMF is specific to purpose, often to the time they remain valid. The Article 2 authorities are not constrained by either of those two considerations.
And by way of clarification, I just want to make clear that the strikes were based on Article 2. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Right. Help me and my constituents understand at what point we go past Article 2. We've talked about if this happens again, we'll be back with some type of, I don't want to say retaliation, but some type of action. Mm-hmm. And how do we know where that fine line is?
I'm going to give you, with some diffidence, a non-lawyer's response to your question for the constituents back home, which is every president, every administration, in every instance where there is contemplation of the use of military force or forces, must consider what the appropriate authority, Article 2, an extant AUMF, soliciting from the Congress an explicit and new authorization, should best be used depending upon the circumstances. And it is very much circumstance, condition dependent.
And I'm sure I don't need to define this, but let me, just for my own sake, say that there's obviously some urgency in Congress to be involved, balancing very carefully with this concept of 535 generals, right? And appreciating any involvement in this as we pass the line, right? And understanding that Congress is anxious to be supportive, but also to be involved.
Well understood.
Let me also ask some questions about our allies. I was pleased to hear that we were joined by two of our allies, the United Kingdom and France. I was pleased that others spoke up to support that, but kind of questioned in my mind why they weren't there to be part of the strikes. Can you help me understand that process and how they're in or out?
Thank you for that question. We have had ongoing consultations, certainly with European allies and with Turkey for a very long time on Syria broadly. There were consultations in the lead up to the strikes, particularly with France and Britain. And the French and British, for geopolitical and historical reasons and reasons of national interest, chose to support us. There are certain constraints in the German system, on legal constraints, political constraints on the ability to participate directly in a strike. I was in Berlin in the lead up to the strikes, and I know that there were a lot of consultations internally. The Germans came out in their own system with the highest level of and most fulsome level of support that they could provide. The Italians were supportive. Turkey was supportive. But I will just say that from our perspective at State Department, we were pleased with the level of engagement and material, not only support, but in the case of France and Great Britain, this was leadership in showing the way towards both the need for the strikes and in taking action and engaging with us when we worked through that.
I apologize, I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.